The city had a way of turning even the purest souls into tainted spirits. As I inhaled the acrid smoke from my ever-present cigar, I watched the rain-slicked streets through the cracked window of my dingy office. The neon sign above my door buzzed sporadically, casting a dim red glow on the tarnished brass nameplate that read, "Jack Marlowe, Private Detective." My name is Jack Marlowe, and I've seen it all in this city of shadows. The cases that walked through my door were seldom clean, and the ones that paid were often dirtier. But it was my life, and it kept me afloat in this sea of vice and deceit. That drizzly evening, a woman walked in, her high heels clicking on the faded linoleum floor. She was tall and elegant, with porcelain skin and a cascade of jet-black hair that tumbled over her shoulders like a midnight waterfall. Her red dress clung to her like a sin, and she wore a hat pulled low over her eyes, casting her features in shadow. "Mr. Marlowe?" she purred. I tipped my fedora slightly, taking in her beauty and the scent of her expensive perfume. "That's me. What can I do for you, doll?" She moved closer, her hips swaying in rhythm with the sultry jazz playing softly on the radio. "I need your help, Mr. Marlowe. I've got a problem, and it's not the kind you can talk about over the phone." I gestured for her to sit, and she slid into the worn leather chair opposite my desk. Her eyes held a hint of desperation, the kind that usually spelled trouble, but I couldn't resist the allure of a mystery wrapped in an enigma. "Start from the beginning," I said, lighting a fresh cigar. The woman introduced herself as Veronica Sinclair, a name as elegant as the dame herself. She explained that her husband, a prominent banker named Robert Sinclair, had recently died in a suspicious car accident. The police had written it off as a tragic accident, but Veronica was convinced it was murder. "I found something," she whispered, leaning closer. "Something that doesn't add up. My husband had been acting strangely before his death, making late-night phone calls and disappearing for hours on end." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What did you find, Mrs. Sinclair?" She handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a torn page from a journal, and it contained a series of cryptic notes and symbols that meant nothing to me at first glance. "He wrote this before he died," she said, her voice trembling. "I think it's a code, a clue to what he was involved in." I studied the page, my detective instincts kicking into gear. The symbols looked like a jumble of nonsense, but I knew better than to dismiss them outright. "Where did you find this?" I asked. Veronica hesitated before answering. "In his secret study, hidden behind a false bookshelf in our home." I nodded slowly, understanding that this case might be more complex than I initially thought. "I'll look into it, Mrs. Sinclair. But I need to know more about your husband's activities and who might have wanted him dead." Veronica leaned back, exhaling a shaky breath. "Robert had connections, Mr. Marlowe. He moved in powerful circles and he had enemies. I don't know who wanted him dead, but I intend to find out." Over the next few days, I delved deeper into the mystery of Robert Sinclair's death. I discovered that he had indeed been involved in some shady dealings. His bank had been laundering money for a notorious mobster known as Salvatore "Slick" Rossi, and there were rumors of embezzlement within the bank's upper echelons. I visited Veronica's mansion, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. The place reeked of old money and secrets. Veronica led me to the secret study, hidden behind a bookshelf in the library, just as she had described. The room was filled with dusty tomes and files, but most intriguing of all was a large wall covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and strings connecting various individuals. "It's Robert's research," Veronica explained, her eyes filled with sadness. "He was trying to expose the corruption within the bank and the ties to Rossi's organization." I studied the wall, recognizing some of the faces. There were prominent bankers, politicians, and even a few law enforcement officers. It seemed that Robert Sinclair had been digging deep, and someone had silenced him before he could expose the truth. As I continued to investigate, I found myself drawn into a web of intrigue and danger. I received anonymous threats and warnings to stay away from the case. The more I dug, the more dangerous it became. But I couldn't turn my back on Veronica, or the tantalizing puzzle that Robert's journal presented. Late one night, I sat in my dimly lit office, poring over Robert Sinclair's journal. I had become obsessed with unraveling the cryptic code he had left behind. The symbols seemed meaningless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they held the key to the mystery. As I studied the page, I noticed a pattern in the placement of the symbols. It was subtle, but it was there. The symbols were arranged in a grid, and certain rows and columns seemed to align. It was a code, all right, but I needed something to crack it. I reached for my phone and dialed Veronica's number. She picked up after a few rings, her voice filled with anxiety. "Mrs. Sinclair, I need to know if your husband had any books on cryptology or ciphers in his study," I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line before she replied, "Yes, he did. I remember seeing a few on his bookshelf." I asked her to bring those books to my office immediately. Within the hour, Veronica arrived, carrying a stack of dusty volumes on codes and ciphers. We spent the night poring over them, trying to decipher the code in Robert's journal. Hours turned into days as we worked tirelessly, but finally, a breakthrough came. We discovered that the symbols corresponded to letters of the alphabet, and with the help of a simple substitution cipher, we decoded the message. "Trust no one. The truth lies beneath the moonlight at the old warehouse." The message led us to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was a decrepit building, a relic of a bygone era. Veronica and I arrived at the warehouse just after midnight, the moon casting an eerie glow over the scene. As we cautiously entered the warehouse, we heard voices in hushed conversation. Shadows moved in the darkness, and the scent of danger hung heavy in the air. We followed the sound of the voices to a dimly lit room at the back of the warehouse. There we found a group of men, some of them familiar faces from the photographs in Robert's secret study. They were arguing heatedly, their voices raised in anger. It was clear that they were involved in the corruption Robert had been investigating. But the biggest surprise came when we saw Salvatore "Slick" Rossi among them. He was a portly man with slicked back hair and a cigar perpetually dangling from his lips. He was the puppeteer behind the scenes, pulling the strings of the city's criminal underworld. Veronica stepped forward, her voice filled with determination. "You killed my husband, Rossi. You thought you could silence him, but you couldn't hide the truth forever." Rossi chuckled, the smoke from his cigar curling around him like a sinister halo. "Ah, Mrs. Sinclair, you're a persistent one, I'll give you that. But you're too late. The truth dies with you." Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, and Rossi's cigar exploded in a burst of sparks and smoke. He fell to the ground, clutching his chest, blood seeping between his fingers. I turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows, gun in hand. It was Detective Max Reynolds, a cop who had been working undercover to expose Rossi's organization. He had been one step ahead of us, and he had saved our lives. With Rossi incapacitated, the other corrupt individuals were arrested, and the truth began to unravel. It turned out that Robert Sinclair had been onto their scheme for years, collecting evidence and trying to expose them. His death had been a desperate attempt to keep his findings from coming to light. As for Veronica, she found closure in knowing that her husband's death had not been in vain. She had also discovered a newfound strength within herself, and she decided to use her wealth and influence to clean up the city's corruption. As for me, Jack Marlowe, the case had changed me. It had reminded me that beneath the smoke and shadows of this city, there was always a glimmer of truth waiting to be uncovered. I may not have found redemption, but I had found a purpose in exposing the darkness that lurked in the hearts of men. Veronica and I parted ways as friends, knowing that we had crossed paths in the darkest of times and emerged stronger for it. The rain still fell, and the city remained a haven for sin and secrets. But I couldn't help but believe that there was a little more light in the world because of our efforts. And so, I continued to sit in my smoke-filled office, waiting for the next mystery to walk through the door, knowing that no matter how deep the shadows, there would always be a glimmer of truth waiting to be revealed.